Good afternoon. Not too many people here yet, but I think more will be coming. We should probably start though. My name is Rhonda Kaler. I am a member at Rondale Baptist Church, and I'm going to be the host for this afternoon session. Before I introduce the presenter, I just wanted to mention that this is going to be live streamed, so you may appear on the video, and if you are interested in seeing this session or any other sessions that you may have missed, you can always go to the Mission Fest YouTube channel and you can catch up with those sessions at a later time. Today our presenter is Wendy Taves. She has been involved with Food for the Hungry as a facilitator for the Ending Poverty Together workshops since 2016. She loves to help groups and individuals to see poverty in a new light. During her trips to Cambodia, she has witnessed firsthand the life-changing effects of the Food for the Hungry philosophy of walking with communities as they move from stuck to thriving during. She lives in Abbotsford with her husband and has 5 grown children. Wendy, take it away.
Well, welcome. We're a small group today, or so far, so that's great. But I'm excited that you're here because you're obviously, you have some questions or some concerns about the poverty that we see around us in our world. And welcome to those who are joining us online as well. So this is just a little piece of the Ending Poverty Together workshop that we do. It's usually a half day to a full day session where we're sitting around tables and we can do a whole lot of conversation around what we're talking about today. Obviously, this is a bit of a different format, but I am going to hopefully ask you to just participate a little bit so that we can learn together. I always love to do that. So today we want to take a few minutes out of our day to deepen our understanding of the root causes and complexities of poverty, and maybe some practical ways that we can respond. And we'll just walk through some of those things. And if you have questions at all, just raise your hand. We can make this really informal, especially since we're just a few of us. So if I were to ask you to finish the sentence, poverty is, what would you say? Tragic. Great. Not enough money? Yep. Hunger. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Yeah, often we get that answer, lack of material things, not able to work, not having the basics of life to sustain yourself. Sometimes people say poverty is generational, basically just not having enough. Right? So there's a lot of different ways to think about poverty, and there's a lot of different symptoms of poverty that we see. So let's set that aside for now, and we're going to come back, circle back to it later on. But as we see the symptoms of poverty all around us, it's important to look further into the root causes of the issue. Because how we define a problem will determine how we go to solve that problem. And the way we view people will directly affect our response to the issues of poverty. If we view people as merely mouths to feed, it will lead us down that dangerous path to talking about people being a problem. But if we view people as God intended them to be, we are going to see that people are not the problem, but they can be part of the solution. So I've had the privilege of traveling to Cambodia with FH, and there's a story from a community there that tells us how important it is to really understand the root cause of an issue. So in this community, it was noted that the malaria rates were really high, and there were multiple NGOs that had come into the community to try to help, and one of them actually gifted the community with mosquito nets. And they gave them instructions to put them over them at night when they were sleeping, and then they left. Well, they measured the cases a short time later, and they realized that they had actually increased. And so when FH came in to walk alongside and observe what was going on there, they realized that, well, people are ingenious and they're creative, and they had put the mosquito nets to really good use. During the day, they used them to fish, and they would drag them along the bottom of the river and pick up all kinds of mosquito larvae. And then they would, just as they were told, put them over top of themselves at night. And so, of course, that just increased that problem. So the NGO had really good intentions of addressing that presenting issue, but they didn't stay long enough to really understand the problem and what was causing it. So when they realized what was going on, the FH staff showed the community how to clean the nets, and so they could still actually use them for fishing and at night, but they were not bringing more harm to themselves. So you can see that how we define a problem is really important in determining our solution to the problem. So imagine then how important it is for us to start with the root causes of a challenge like poverty. And to do that, we can go back to Genesis 1, where God created humankind in his image to be in relationship. And in his original plan for creation, he gave people 4 key relationships: relationship with God, relationship with others, with creation, and with self. And he intended these relationships to be healthy and whole. But then in Genesis 3, we read that Adam and Eve sinned, and this affected everything that God created and intended to be good, and all of their relationships were broken. And ever since then, we have needed reconciliation in our relationships with God, with others, with self, and with creation. So, what if we saw poverty as broken relationships needing to be reconciled? I'm going to say that again. What if we saw poverty as broken relationships needing to be reconciled? When I first heard that in an FH workshop, it kind of rocked my world. Because suddenly, who of us does not have some broken relationships in one of those 4 areas? Suddenly, there's poverty in my life. Suddenly, that puts me on an equal plane with anyone living in poverty, because we all have poverty, a form of poverty in our lives. So how would that impact our understanding of poverty and its solution? Suddenly, it is not us and them. It is not the haves and have-nots, right? It's about we all have broken relationships. So thinking back to your original definition of poverty, how does this compare? Does it change that at all for you? Something that's really worth maybe considering and spending some time kind of thinking about. Bryant Myers, in his book Walking with the Poor, says this: poverty is the result of relationships that do not work, that are not just, that are not for life, that are not harmonious or enjoyable. Poverty is the absence of shalom in all its meanings. So the Hebrew word shalom conveys feeling, intent, and emotion, and it goes much deeper than just peace. It's a complete peace, a feeling of contentment, completeness, wholeness, well-being, harmony. It's a really rich word. So what forms of poverty does our culture suffer from as a result of each broken relationship? On the next slide, you're going to see a chart, and I'd like just what are we, 6 of us, 7 of us, to do a little bit of brainstorming about what forms of poverty does our culture suffer from? What do we see in our culture as a form of poverty that results from each of these broken relationships? So, a broken relationship with God, what form of poverty does that show up as in our culture, do you think? Any thoughts?
sin, like any, sin in general.
Yeah. You're right. I was thinking today, that one's kind of overarching. So let's start with self. Let's go on to self. We'll come back to the other one. What's next? Yeah, self. Can you think of forms of poverty with a broken relationship with ourself? Addictions, yep. Addictions. Identity, for sure, yeah. Especially our identity that God's given us, right? It can be either overblown, we are our own God, or we really don't see ourselves as fearfully and wonderfully made and in God's image, right? So it can be on either end of that spectrum, for sure. Anything else? I think of mental illness. I think God doesn't, in his ideal plan, that's not something that we are supposed to deal with, right? And so I think that is a form of broken relationship with ourselves, right? Shame, for sure. Yeah. And again, so many of these can overlap, right? So what about our relationship with others? Where do you see a form of poverty in broken relationship with others? Lack of community, right? Yeah. Abuse. Yes, for sure. Divorce, yeah, broken families, right? Whether it's divorce or whether it's other relationships in the family that are broken. Loneliness, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's part of that lack of community thing too, right? Yeah. And what about, what form of poverty do we see in a broken relationship with creation? So God has called us to take care of the earth and steward it well. I think we don't always do that. On the other end of the spectrum, I think God has also put us in a certain balanced relationship with the earth and with creation, with animals, and sometimes that balance, it's out of balance from what God has intended. So those are some ways that we see forms of poverty to do with these broken relationships. So let's go back to our broken relationship with God, because we didn't cover that one too much. Sin on a broad level, of course, but what forms of poverty do we see with a broken relationship with God?
A lot of other religions, especially religions, like they say that Christianity is God reaching down to us
Yep.
and doing something for us, and other religions being, I'm going to do this so that I'm good enough for God.
Right. And I think, so I'm just going to repeat that for those who are online. Other religions are often trying to work their way, to please their God. And I think that sometimes we as Christians fall into that a little bit too, even though we know in our heads that we don't need to. So that would definitely be one of those forms of poverty where we are working instead of living in grace. Anything else? I think addictions would fall under there too. Yeah, I think probably our broken relationship with God is sort of an umbrella over all of the other ones. I think that's true. Yeah. I think sometimes we also, even something as simple as self-sufficiency, we think we can sort of handle our own life, right, without God at times. And even that can be a broken relationship, and it's not as God intended it, right? So as you can see, lots of forms of poverty in these broken relationships, and those broken relationships are the basis for a lot of the rest of the poverty symptoms that we see. And so what FH often talks about, we need to address the root causes of poverty before it will permanently affect all of the other symptoms of poverty. So when we're faced with poverty due to these broken relationships, we all have different responses. So we're going to watch a video that captures one woman's journey, and it's well expressed, and you might actually find yourself relating to some of her observations. So let's watch that.
The stories we tell about each other matter very much. The stories we tell ourselves about our own lives matter. And most of all, I think the way that we participate in each other's stories is of deep importance. I was 6 years old when I first heard stories about the poor. Now, I didn't hear those stories from the poor themselves. I heard them from my Sunday school teacher and Jesus, kind of by my Sunday school teacher. I remember learning that people who were poor needed something material, food, clothing, shelter, that they didn't have. And I also was taught, coupled with that, that it was my job, this classroom full of 5 and 6 year old children, it was our job, apparently, to help. This is what Jesus asked of us. And in that he said, what you do for the least of these, you do for me. Now, I was pretty psyched. I was very eager to be useful in the world. I think we all have that feeling. And also it was kind of interesting that God needed help. That was news to me, and it felt like it was a very important thing to get to participate in. But I also learned very soon thereafter that Jesus also said, and I'm paraphrasing, the poor would always be with us. This frustrated and confused me. I felt like I had been just given a homework assignment that I had to do, and I was excited to do, but no matter what I would do, I would fail. So I felt confused, a little bit frustrated and angry, like maybe I'd misunderstood something here, and I felt overwhelmed. And for the first time, I began to fear this group of people and to feel negative emotion towards a whole group of people. I imagined in my head a kind of long line of individuals that were never going away, that would always be with us. They were always going to ask me to help them and give them things, which I was excited to do, but I didn't know how it was going to work. And I didn't know what would happen when I ran out of things to give, and especially if the problem was never going away. In the years following, the other stories I heard about the poor growing up were no more positive. For example, I saw pictures and images frequently of sadness and suffering. I heard about things that were going wrong in the lives of the poor. I heard about disease. I heard about war. They always seemed to be kind of related. And in general, I got this sort of idea that the poor in the world, lived lives that were wrought with suffering and sadness, devastation, hopelessness. And after a while, I developed what I think many of us do, this predictable response, where I started to feel bad every time I heard about them. I started to feel guilty for my own relative wealth because I wasn't doing more, apparently, to make things better. And I even felt a sense of shame because of that. And so, naturally, I started to distance myself. I stopped listening to their stories quite as closely as I had before. And I stopped expecting things to really change. Now, I still gave. On the outside, it looked like I was still quite involved. I gave of my time and my money. I gave when solutions were on sale. The cost of a cup of coffee can save a child's life, right? I mean, who can argue with that? I gave when I was cornered, when it was difficult to avoid. And I gave, in general, when the negative emotions build up enough that I gave to relieve my own suffering, not someone else's. But truth be told, I was giving out of that place, not out of a genuine place of hope and excitement to help and of generosity. It became a transaction for me, became sort of a trade. I was purchasing something. I was buying my right to go on with my day and not necessarily be bothered by this bad news. And I think the way that we go through that sometimes can, first of all, disembody a group of people, individuals out there in the world, and it can also turn into a commodity, which is a very scary thing. So as I did this, and as I think many of us do this, we kind of buy our distance, we buy our right to go on with our day. I think that exchange can actually get in the way of the very thing that we want most. It can get in the way of our desire to really be meaningful and useful in another person's life, and in short, to love.
So anything in there that you can relate to? Is there There's usually a few lines in there that people really resonate with.
It is easy to give, like I'll be a little bit vulnerable here and say my own tendency
Yeah.
is to, I need to be needed,
Yeah.
and so, like I've found that it has fed my, when I help people, my
Yeah.
need to be needed.
Mhm.
And, God has been bringing me out of that and just, like letting my value be based on Him and
Yeah.
not what I'm doing for somebody.
Right, yeah. And in case those online didn't hear, she was talking about giving because it helps us to feel needed, and sometimes basing our self-worth on that, right? Yeah. I often think about her line, buying my right to go on with my day. I thought that's a very interesting perspective. Anything else anyone wants to add to that? That you kind of hit you from that? Yeah. 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 I give to relieve my own suffering, as in guilt, right? Yeah, that one too often hits me. Yeah. The other thing that she pointed out is that we often don't stop and learn the stories about those living in poverty. That we talk about people living in poverty, but we don't talk with them or engage with them. And how much easier is it to give money or donate things? Or to get discouraged when we see all of the symptoms of poverty around us, right? And maybe even inside of us. And I'm sure that many of us can relate to many of her sentiments. It's, I think, as North American Christians, it's pretty common for what she's saying. So we've heard about Jessica Jackley's experience with what poverty has been, and maybe we've seen ourselves in there somewhere. But let's talk about some guidelines to keep in mind as we try to help without inadvertently hurting and causing harm to people. So if you've ever read the book When Helping Hurts, and if you haven't, actually, I highly recommend it, the authors suggest this. One of the biggest mistakes that North American churches make, by far, is applying relief in situations where rehabilitation or development is the appropriate intervention. So what do we really mean by those terms? Relief, rehabilitation, development, those are all, can mean lots of things. But I want to submit that relief is pretty obvious. It's the urgent and temporary provision of emergency aid to reduce immediate suffering. So often it's life and death relief, right? Hurricanes, earthquakes, deaths in a family, accident or hospitalization, floods. Right now is very relevant around here. I don't know if any of you have been personally touched by that. I'm from Abbotsford, BC, and if you watched the news a couple months ago, you know that we were in a flood zone as well. I live actually right on the edge of that flood zone, was evacuated several times. Didn't have water in our house, thankfully. Our business is in Chilliwack, so of course roads were closed between the two. So all kinds of things going on. Of course, for us it was inconvenient, and that's all. But there were many, many people on that prairie that needed relief, and they needed help. And there were evacuation centers set up. There was food donated by various organizations and restaurants, and there was temporary housing and shelter for people who were displaced. And my husband and I spent a Saturday afternoon and evening one day helping the army sandbag in our neighborhood because there was supposed to be a second wave coming through. And we made food for all of those soldiers and men who were sandbagging. So that was the relief part of it that we needed. Now, once it stopped raining and stopped flooding, then we moved into rehabilitation. And the definition of rehabilitation, it starts as soon as the immediate suffering has stopped. So the key phrase is moving from doing for to doing with. So we still, a lot of people still needed a hand, right? They needed some help. They needed others to help find more permanent shelter. They went back to their homes and started to clean up. They needed some financial assistance, but they were starting to be involved in that rehabilitation. So, and then development is the process of ongoing change where both the helpers and the helped are moving into a right relationship and using their gifts and talents. So that's the rebuilding part, and that's where the families who were going back to their homes needed to decide, are we ripping everything apart? Can we, do we want to change things now that we have to rip it apart? I had a friend who had a finished basement, got all flooded, and she said, well, since we're doing it anyway, let's change this and let's change that. So it's their vision, and they are a part of now redeveloping and rebuilding. This is the long-term work. And at Food for the Hungry, this is the part we call walking with. So why do you think it is that we so often apply relief when we should be applying rehabilitation or development? If we believe what Corbett and Fickard said about the North American churches, apply relief when they should be doing rehabilitation and development, why do you think that is? It's more urgent, yep. Yep. But when it moves out of being urgent and we stay in the relief, why do we do that? You don't have to be engaged. Often you don't, yeah. You can send money, right? Yeah. Other things? Why else do you think? Absolutely. It takes a lot of time to develop those long-term development relationships, right? Yeah. Relief is quick and easy, in and out, right? Give, do, Whereas rehabilitation and development is the long-term stuff. You're right, requires relationship. And it's what we're used to, right? Our society, our culture moves on so quickly from one disaster to the next, and we just continue to do relief. And often I think about some of these stories that we have of disasters in the world, and a month later I think, I wonder what happened there. I wonder how they're doing. I wonder what's going on, because you never hear about it again, right? So that relief is easy and quick, and just do something, give something, move on. And I think that's why we often do apply relief when we should be applying other things. So rather than focusing on all the things we shouldn't be doing, though, I do want to look at Scripture as a model of a healthy way to engage with the most vulnerable. Now, if you have a Bible, or if you have a Bible on your phone and you want to follow along, feel free. I'm going to be looking at 2 Kings 4, 1-7. So the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing here at all," she said, "except a small jar of olive oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another." But he replied, "There's not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." So thinking about what we've been talking about a little bit today, do we see some positive examples of healthy model of community development. Do you see some of the things that Elisha has done? And we're seeing this passage maybe a little differently today. I know we haven't gone quite as deep into it as we often do in these workshops, but where did he start? Sorry? Yeah, he asked what she had, right? Yeah, what she could contribute. Absolutely. What other question did he ask her? I'm sorry, I don't have the passage up here. She had to participate. Yeah. He started with, how can I help you? So often I think we step into a problem and say, oh, here, this is what needs to be done. Oh, here, this needs to be solved. I'll just do this for you. Right? He asked, how can I help you? You tell me. You tell me what you need. And then, like you said, he said, what do you have? These are two questions that FH models their community development on. Is they step into the community, and first, before they do anything, how can we help you? And what do you have? And they assume that they have things to contribute to helping themselves out of poverty. What else did you hear anything else in there? I know, like I said, you don't have the passage necessarily in front of you.
Well, I guess she says, oh, we have a jar of oil. And he says, use it, and gives a suggestion.
Right. Yes. So you're saying, he asked her, what do you have? And she said, I just have a jar of oil. And he said, use it. And the other thing that I took out of that you didn't say is that she had to choose whether she wanted to do that or not, right? She made a choice whether to listen to what he said or not when he gave her a suggestion. Yeah. Did you notice, too, that he involved her family and her neighbors? It was a community thing, right? It wasn't just her. He wasn't just saying, you're on your own, now go do this. He brought in her whole community. The one thing I really love about that passage is that Elisha left space for God to work. So often when we step into issues, especially of poverty or of helping others, we forget to leave that space for God to work. We think we can do it all and we can take care of it. But you leave that space and suddenly there's no question that God did it, right? Elisha wasn't in there. He's going to turn it. There we go. Sorry about that. So we don't sometimes leave that space for God to act and do those miracles that he wants to do, and we instead take credit for it. Anything else you saw in there that you want to contribute? It's a pretty rich passage, actually, when you look at it that way, and when you look at it in light of working with poverty alleviation. It gives us a lot of guidance. So it's impossible for us to stand here and say, have a complete list of do's and don'ts. The reality is that each situation that you find yourself in when you're working with the vulnerable is going to require discernment and consideration of a number of different factors that are at play. What we don't want to see
is that people say, oh, I'm going to mess it up, so I'm not going to do anything. It's just important to consider these principles as we move into determining whether we're applying the right response. And so in our full workshop, we go further into some of those guiding principles. And as I said, we have sitting around tables and we have time to really talk through some of these principles. In the meantime, I'd like to invite you at your leisure to go to our website called endingpovertytogether.org. And it's an online collaborative effort to provide Canadians with educational resources from like-minded organizations across Canada. In addition, we also host a podcast called Ending Poverty Together, where we discuss big questions about poverty in bite-sized ways, both here and abroad. So what does all this mean for an organization like Food for the Hungry? I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. FH does relief, and COVID-19 is a good example of when we provide relief. However, the primary work for FH is healthy development. So let me share a little bit of some of the things that we have found useful in our work, and we do believe that many of these principles can be used in our local issues with poverty as well. So we want to ensure in all situations that we are attempting to apply the appropriate people, resources, and ideas. And on a field level, we have national staff that walk alongside communities for approximately 8 to 10 years, and they engage them in assessment activities and understanding the vision for their community before any programming activity begins. So they just really take some time, and each of our country offices, because of their unique circumstances, has developed also a unique plan of action. It's not a cookie-cutter thing for every country. But the general pattern is they go in and they listen. They start with listening. So as I said, it's national staff that live in the community. They know the language, they know the customs, they know the country. So 98% of our staff are nationals. And they form relationships for years before action is actually taken, because it's so important for that community to be involved in that vision. And they're determining different barriers that have kept this community from flourishing. So then the next thing is envisioning. Together with the church, community, and civic leaders, they will build relationship and understand their vision for their community. And then they'll work with them to help identify goals and dreams that the community wants to achieve. So for example, one village that I went to in Cambodia, when FH started there, they said to the chief in that particular village, what is it that is difficult for you? What is the challenge for you? And he said, well, I'm tired of my people drowning. So they were situated right beside a river that flooded twice a year, overflowed the banks, and cut them off from the nearest town. And so the children were trying to swim across the river to get to school. Women who were pregnant were trying to get to doctors and swimming across the river. And many people were drowning in the river every year, trying to get across this swollen river. And so this FH worked alongside the community to start a vision to build a bridge over this river. Sounds simple, but this is what they really needed to help them thrive. And so they worked together to actually pool resources. And so it wasn't even a thing where, it was just given to them, everything they needed. They pulled together as a community to pool their resources to get the supplies to build this bridge, and they worked together to get it made. And when I was there, they were so proud, and we sat around and they had pictures of all of the process of building the bridge, and they took us for a walk across the bridge, and they were beaming, and they were so excited that they had come up with a solution to their problem, and that their village was thriving because they now could get to town easily. And then they showed me where they realized just in the spring flood that there was one part of the bridge that wasn't quite sturdy enough, and so they had repaired it, and they had shored it up so that it was going to be stronger and it was going to be fine the next time the water came up. And that just builds the confidence and the dignity in those people in that community, and we can help ourselves. We can support our families, and we can get ourselves out of poverty with a little bit of support and walking alongside. So we then partner with a lot of different people. Become partners for FH. They come in all forms, whether they're one-time donors, from gift guide purchases, from child sponsorship. Churches sometimes sponsor a whole community. Businesses and community partners sponsor a community, foundations. And then after that, we celebrate. After about 8 or 10 years, when they are self-sustaining, Food for the Hungry leaves. But they first commemorate the achievement by a big graduation celebration. I'm actually hoping this summer to head to Rwanda with the FH team to celebrate a graduation of a community in Rwanda. I think that I've seen videos of those, and I think it would just be amazing to be at one of those graduation celebrations. And what I love about it is, in those 8 to 10 years, as that community becomes self-sustaining, they have also been taught to help and teach another community. Often their neighboring communities will say, "Hey, what are you doing? We want that. We want to do what you're doing. How are you doing this?" And they will teach them, and they'll actually, as their cows have calves, they will give them a calf to start their own herd. And so those kinds of things that just sort of are once the ball gets rolling, and it just keeps going. So before we do our question and answer time, I'd like to close our session today by praying a Benedictine blessing over us. If you are comfortable to stand, feel free. If not, just stay sitting where you are. But I just want to pray this over us, and then if there's questions, we can do that. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. Sorry, I can never make it through that. So I hope this has just sort of whetted your appetite, and hopefully we can sit down and do a whole day's workshop someday together, and that would be really great. So I don't know, do you want me to do question and answer, or you? All right. And those online, if you want to put it in the chat, go ahead, and we'll have someone here ask the question. Any questions at all? Follow up? Yeah. Oh. Yeah, no, it's more than food. So she's hearing that we're building bridges, and she thought it was just food. No, actually, we work, so the bridge was that particular community, and that was what was keeping them stuck, one of the things that was keeping them stuck. But in every community, Okay, there we go. So you're asking whether we build bridges, and you thought we were just about food for the hungry. So the bridge was what that community needed to help them get out of poverty. But they also work always with educating with agriculture, whether it's animals or crops. There's child sponsorship. So we're working in the education, sanitization, whether it's clean water or toilets, bathrooms. There's savings and loans groups. I actually had a chance to sit in on one of the savings and loans groups. So they'll train them in how they can sort of pool their money and do these savings and loans groups where they can lend money to each other for their crops and for their kids' school uniforms, those kinds of things. So it is really a holistic community development project, and it does include much more than food. But teaching them to grow food and feed their families is part of it, and all that agriculture training. But yeah, the name is a little bit, it's a little bit deceiving because it's not just about food, for sure. Thank you, that's a good question. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Yes, yeah, teaching them to fish in so many different areas. Gender equality in some countries is a big thing that helps too. We help women start businesses, whether it's sewing or, yeah, I've seen all kinds of different businesses that they've started. So, yeah, more than just food. Yes?
How do you go about establishing that initial connection with communities? Which was process?
That's a very good question. So the question is, how do you go about establishing that initial relationship with a community? I'm going to be really honest here and say that I actually don't work directly every day in the office of FH. I actually do workshops for them and work alongside them in some of those areas, these kinds of things. So I'm not actually sure how those initial connections are made. I know that sometimes it comes from when they work in one community, then there's other communities around there that want to work with them too. Yeah, but I can try and find that out for you if you'd like to leave me your name. Yeah. Anything on the chat there? No? Okay. Yeah, that is typical. So yes, 8 to 10 years is a typical time for them to stay. What they find is that is a time that they are truly self-sustaining, and it can be a little less, and it can be a little bit more. At the beginning, they sort of have some markers of where, what self-sustaining looks like. And so they will stay until that happens. But it's always, what I love is it's always directed by the community and the community leaders and the community families. It's not something that FH sort of pushes to, reach by a certain time or that they mandate, but they just walk alongside and really encourage and help them take those steps that they need to be taking to get where they're going. Yeah, but they help to make that vision as they go along too. So it's not FH building a vision for them, it's actually them building a vision and FH walking alongside. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I know it sounds like a long time, doesn't it? Yeah, but I think that's the whole long-term work of development, right? It's not just sort of dropping a solution and leaving. And I think so many of our organizations are changing that. Years ago, we did a lot of that, right? I think, and so many of us now are changing our philosophies and understanding that we need to more empower people rather than just jump in and do something and leave, right? Yeah. Other questions, anyone? Is there evangelizing that goes on? Yes, absolutely, yeah. FH is a Christian-based organization. And it's something that they do acknowledge that first you need to be able to eat and live before you can, maybe talk about eternal things, because they can't even, barely make it through the day. So it's that combination for sure. Yeah. Oh, good question. Does FH work in communities that are wealthy? Yeah. Materially wealthy, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Right now, they are working in 7 countries that would not be considered wealthy materially. However, they are based in Canada, and there's also affiliates in the US and the UK and in Switzerland. We feel like our job here in Canada is education and really just adjusting how we see poverty, and that we understand that we also have poverty in our lives in different forms. So what that means is really it can be applied here in Canada too, all of those philosophies. Yeah. Right, you're thinking about the Native communities. Yeah, definitely. That is something that FH hasn't specifically stepped into. However, again, the philosophy that we're working with, it's obviously it would be the same kind of thing in an Indigenous community. Yeah. Yeah, great question. Great question. Yeah, the question is, if we are not, how can we live this out in our own communities, right? And so I think for me, and I can only say for myself, what it's done is, first of all, made me look at poverty very differently. Made me see that it's not I have stuff and they don't, and that makes them in poverty and me not. I realize that I have poverty in my life due to those broken relationships. And so that puts me on a bit more of an even, it's not us and them, I look at maybe those who are a little more have not as far as materially, with more dignity, with an equal value, obviously in God's eyes, and an equal amount to contribute. Everyone has something to contribute. It doesn't matter whether you're materially poor. And then in that way, just remembering to give people dignity. And even if you see forms of poverty, maybe they have lots materially, but you see forms of poverty in their life, to give them dignity and to understand a little better what that's all about. And it's a poverty of relationship. Yeah, and I think I think here in Winnipeg, you have the same problem that we do in Abbotsford as far as not having enough services or whatever for people who are living in homelessness, right? And I think even just giving the dignity, understanding that just giving them stuff isn't the solution, and giving them dignity when you do come across people, and understanding that they need a relationship as well, and treating them equally, right? Those are some of the things that have made a difference in my life. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's something we really need to all wrestle with individually, and taking these concepts and saying, what does that mean for me in my life and in my relationships or in my circles of people that I come across. Mm-hmm. Oh. Okay, so you're asking about the end of the video because I stopped it. She actually founded a microfinance company that helps women start businesses in, I believe it's in, again, underdeveloped countries. But I think more and more and more, our own country needs some of these things that we're doing in other countries. I think we see it more and more, that it's not just an over there thing, right? Yeah. Thanks for that.
It really is, like with a lot of ladies here are like being sexually exploited, trafficked.
Mm-hmm.
And for them to start business, businesses and stuff would be huge.
Yep.
A way that they can get out of that lifestyle.
Yep. I think and so, sorry, I'll just repeat what you're saying about in our own country, there are women who are being exploited and trafficked, and that they could also use this starting new businesses, microfinancing, all of that. And I totally agree. And I think the start of it is, I think, for us in the developed countries to get out of denial that that is happening in our country, right? That's a little bit of an editorial comment, but. Anything else? Well, then I will just say thank you very much for sitting in on this little session, and I hope to see you at an Ending Poverty Together workshop. And if not, go online, check out some of the other resources that are in our endingpovertytogether.org. Thanks.
And those are great questions.
Yeah, very good question. Oh, this.